Turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction. The worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Of course, that is The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. And thank you, Zamir, for the accompaniment once again.
Nice to open with you again.
Yes.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for joining us here on the third episode in the series, The Pandemic is a Prism. And I'm very delighted to introduce to you our next guest, who will join us shortly on the stage. And in many ways, those of you who've been following my work over the last years, including a number of short films and interviews and things, the running joke is I probably quote Steve 3 or 4 times in most things I do. And that's why I'm delighted to have him here on the show in this format, and particularly around this prism, which coincides with Steve's recent release, which is a book, his new book, A Generation's Worth, Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns. And we're going to get into that a little bit with Steve as we begin the conversation. But first, just to say a little bit more that many might know Steve as the grief walker, one who spent many years in the death trade and wrote about it in the book Die Wise, which I think came out around the 2016 or so. And in some ways felt like reading his story about it, that it was perhaps the last thing he could write before perhaps the time came for him, which it didn't, gratefully so. And since then, he's given himself to look at a number of areas with the similar kind of inquiry, that is matrimony, elderhood, and money alongside death. And all of these things were then reanimated in some ways by the plague that has come among us. And so that with that, I mean, it's, and I'm already a quarter of the way through the book now, and it's illuminating in ways too, which I find deeply helpful and necessary. And so grateful to have Stephen with us here on the show, on the series. Welcome, Stephen.
Gentlemen, thank you. What a thing that you conjured with that reading. This Yeats, I mean, it just occurred to me as I was listening to you, Yeats sends a get well card to the 20th century. That's what that poem is. It's not a love letter. It's a get well card. And get well cards, they mean well, but they're short on strategy. And it's an amazing evocative. There, but for the grace of God, go I. Illumination in what constitutes darkness. It's just, I haven't heard it in a long time, and I really appreciate that you kick things off in such a rousing fashion. That you used a get well card to the 20th century to cue us up.
Can you elaborate on that a bit, on that poem? If it sounds like you've read it and contemplated it a fair bit, and strike some chords. Yeah,
well, I mean, there's nothing that can touch those last several lines, and Rough Beast and I did a record called Rough Gods, which is not an attempt to echo that, but certainly to further the notion. And, slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. I mean, the verb to slouch is just extraordinary evocative rendering of the kind of flaccid nature of the flabby democracies of the West in the 20th century, really. The kind of, you would say, untested by any real severe adversity. So the consequences is turning inwards in search of the adversity that should otherwise underwrite your health as a culture. You take upon yourself all kind of symptoms to give your spirit something to do. And this is, collectively speaking, this is what presaged, I think, the pandemic. That we were already in the arc of self-absorption in the extreme to give us something for our, quote, spirit to work on. I mean, the irony is that it's like chewing on your own teeth when your spirit works on itself for the sake of improvement and growth. It's grinding away on your own molars. It's understandable, and it's an activity of a kind, but there's only really dust to show for the endeavor. That's sort of what I mean.
If I just ask, speaking on that flabby democracy, what about those lines? The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. What does that signal to us?
Well, it's like he's looking over our shoulder in the last, 20 months.
Yeah, exactly. That's how it feels.
I mean, the best poetry, the best art doesn't foretell the future. It's a relentless and ruthless examination of the current regime. I don't mean by that a political structure. I mean the goofy participatory neuroses that have constituted the West subsequent to the world wars, basically. And he didn't need to know about a pandemic to write that poem clearly. Although I'm not exactly sure the timing of it, whether the Spanish flu had occurred by the time he wrote the poem. So somebody who's listening knows more about these things than I do. An English major, no doubt. Now it's finally coming useful. But, the best prophets are not good at the future. They're good at the present. And their work makes the present, in a prismatic function, apropos of your title, more available than simply living it out tends to do, right? It makes it not only vivid, but livid. And it's a different tonality, I think, to that exercise. So this is soothsaying. That's what the old Anglo-Saxon speakers meant with the term. Soothsaying is the activity of lending yourself so unreservedly to the present moment that you keep nothing back for this allegation called the future. So all you can really be relied upon is an intense version of current affairs. But if anybody's paying attention, the near future is easily inferred from that excruciating focus.
Steve, in the book now, I'm in the chapter actually of in matrimony, which again is a really compelling inquiry in the midst of a in the midst of the plague. But you have a line which maybe is appropriate here, which is, you say, good stories don't tell you about something, they tell you something. Yeah. And the reason I bring that up now is because, as I look out at this moment, there's a number of stories that are, you could say, jostling for supremacy around what's going on. And in some ways, there's the crisis of trying to pick the one, right, based on one's own orientation or belief in authority or not, or whatever it is. And so I just wonder if we could start there to say, what are the main stories that are being offered up, and therefore, and what are they telling us actually that maybe they don't know that they're telling us?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, I'm not persuaded that stories is the best way to account for what's going on. In other words, I wouldn't blame stories for the debris along the highway of the 21st century at all. Stories don't argue. They have no skin in the game, right? They are their own prevalence. So this is the beautiful thing about this is why you can remember a story in a way you can't remember an hypothesis or an argument or a line of inquiry. I mean, if you really commit yourself to it, you can remember it. If it happens to come from you, maybe you can remember it. But there's something about stories, and we all know this intuitively, that they virtually tell themselves if you lend any part of your scrutiny or give a shit or willingness to attend to things to them, right? And it doesn't matter that you can't find the beginning. You begin instead. That's what storytelling is. And the best storytelling goes like this. Do you want a gifted storyteller to tell you a story? Yes, I do. Then you begin to tell a story very badly. And the gifted storyteller will not be able to sit by the sidelines and endure the mauling of the story that you're perpetrating, right? And so usually with some grace, hopefully, the storyteller will gently intervene and suggest it actually goes something like this, and everybody looks at each other satisfied that the subterfuge actually worked and the master is finally at work, right? Okay. So I don't think that the arguments, the hyperboles, the high octane, low fiber, high fructose, ungenerative, ungenerous diatribing that's going on now should ever be referred to as a story. And let's just drop the word narrative because it's too easily confused or conflated with the word story. And you're back to what? Argument, allegation, what I've called in the last book, the obsidian certainties of the 20th century, by which I mean, obsidian is a remarkable volcanic rock, right? And it came into being, this is a kind of metaphor I'm speaking now, that it came into being as a consequence of stone literally being melted and being turned liquid and highly volatile. And it cooled in a certain fashion that it didn't reconstitute itself as rock. It reconstituted itself as volcanic glass, which can take on an almost surgical cutting edge. But by virtue of its of the period of its genesis, is remarkably brittle. So that goes to say basically that the more extreme a position that you occupy in any given matter, the more likely it is that your certainty will shatter, or you try to inflict it upon the proper ambivalent nature of the way things are.
Yeah, well, beautifully said.
Okay, so the case I'm making is I'm making a plea on behalf of ambivalence. If we come to the matter at hand just for a second. Science, the allegation of cabals of influence and things. Look, these things predated the pandemic, obviously, and we bring that repertoire to the pandemic. And like any consumer culture at its best, and this is certainly one, what we're doing is simply absorbing the latest incarnation that would properly challenge our take on things into our take on things. And we just absorb it, amoeba-like, derive some kind of high fructose nourishment from it, and move on, right? And so sadly, one of the things I'm seeing, hopefully this is a beginning answer to the question that you properly asked, is that these extremities, this obligation seemingly to choose, and to choose fiercely rather than wisely, and rather than to submit yourself and your own predilections to scrutiny, you have an obligation to instead to a relentless kind of unwillingness to look over your shoulder. And this is deemed heroic, and people of exactly this ilk will lean on your windshield and scream at you through the glass, "I'm doing this for you."
Yes.
You see?
Yeah. So that self-righteousness,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
that self-righteousness, where is that self-righteousness coming from? What is self-righteousness?
Always been there.
Yeah.
It's always, a consumer culture is so unsure of itself, right? Because its principal activity is buying power, buying and selling, processing, defecating. That's basically it. As a philosopher after the Second World War said, how would you characterize the 20th century? The human part of it? The modern human being fornicated and read the newspapers, he said. There's probably another activity or two, but generally speaking, you understand the kind of nihilism of the take on things. And finally then, apropos of extremity for its own sake, there's an old expression, strong opinions weakly held, right? It certainly characterizes the current regime. P.S. If you've ever had a planter's wart on your foot, the chances are very good that the practitioner in question applied liquid nitrogen to the wart itself to, quote, burn it away, but not with heat, with an intense cold that has indistinguishably the same consequence. What am I saying with this analogy? I'm saying that when human beings engage in extremes of behavior and allegation and certainties and quote unquote beliefs and so forth, there's something about the nature of intensity itself that they bend as they depart from the mid-range of emotional possibility. They tend to bend towards each other to the point where the extremes begin to resemble each other much more than the thing they were once upon a time opposed to. And you can't distinguish light from dark and heat from cold, and you guessed it, love from hate. They're now too close, you see. And so there's some real merit in at least some of us occupying something like a middle ground, which is confessedly uncertain of itself, and leave the faux certainties to the extremists in hopes that their extremism will reveal itself and people can talk themselves down from the perch. We are in the very early stages, it seems to me, of any possible talking ourselves down from the perch right now. There's a reward system in place for occupying ever higher branches on the lunacy tree.
Well, thanks for that, Steve. What comes to me is the, how do I say it, like, without sort of romanticizing a kind of village-ness, but where would one look to, quote, know what is true, right? When a time when, I think called it the sibling society, right, is rampant. And I imagine, for example, that in an intact culture, when maybe there's a sense of what is going on or, where to look to, that they would look to the elders, right, to say, okay, you're true, or at least my understanding, the elders were true to the responsibility to life, the responsibility to the wider story, I suppose. And so in that sense, for me, is that what this is telling us as well, that with the breakdown of that, quote, where to look for that truing, suddenly it's, I think Ken Wilber even used the phrase, aperspectival madness, almost like being in the funhouse of mirrors. It's like, it doesn't matter where you look, you can be affirmed or confirmed or not. And so is that another thing that might be trying to teach us?
And sorry, to add to that, being in a time where whatever you believe, you can find evidence to support it from so many sources that you can rabidly hold on to.
But beliefs don't need any evidence.
Mm.
You see, that's not how they function.
Mm.
There's no such thing as a belief in search of a bona fide reinforcing sequence of information and so forth that makes the belief hold water. Okay, that's not how beliefs work.
Mm.
Beliefs are self-sustaining, are they not? And in this sense, they're virtually indistinguishable from prejudices. Here's what I mean. This is apropos of your some of the aspects of elderhood that you mentioned now.
Mm.
I gave myself the project a couple of years ago to wonder to myself, given the limitations of gathering, to wonder to myself whether it was possible to inherit wisdom. That's where I began the inquiry. And I'm just going to very briefly replay, the stones along the path that interrupted my procession and stubbed my toes, but gave me finally some respite from my own self-appointed task of becoming certain on the matter. And this is what I come up with. So, is it possible to inherit prejudice? The quick answer is no. To inherit wisdom. The quick answer is no. Why? Well, you have to consider what inheritance is and then what wisdom is to do so. So I reversed my field, as I often do, and wondered, is it possible to inherit prejudice? Let's begin there instead. And the answer came thunderingly back to me. Not only is it possible, it's the only way you can come by it. You see? How so? It's in the nature of prejudice. The word is telling you something. Prejudging. It means the allegation of certainty that precedes your encounter with the thing that you've crafted some certainty about. Mm. You bring the certainty to the encounter. You don't derive it from the encounter. No, that's what prejudice is. So it helps to loosen it from, quote, racial prejudice, for example, or any other kind. You wonder about it as a functioning thing. You think about it as an animist would, not an analyst would. Okay? And it seems to me you come up with that. So the amazing thing about prejudice is it needs no reinforcement. Nobody wakes up in the morning who's possessed of a prejudice and goes, man, I feel my prejudice is slipping. I'm going to have to really work on those things today. In fact, I got to get myself to an adult rehabilitation center to re-up on my capacity to bear these prejudices along. Nobody does, right? Anybody who's possessed of a prejudice looks out the window and says, yeah, I got information for the next 40 days that sustain my prejudices with no hesitation whatsoever. And then, God help us, I meet another human being, it's over. I got a year's worth. In one little account, I know I'm being a little extreme here, but you take the point though. Prejudices are self-sustaining. They don't need any evidence, right? And they tolerate absolutely no naysaying or divergence from the central command's position. The amazing thing about wisdom is that even though it's easily confused with prejudice, the confusion is only in the mind of the prejudicial person. Because in the mind of a wise person who's been entrusted with the wisdom, they know the nature of wisdom is site-specific, localized, time-limited, okay, and of a very truncated applicability, right? Okay, so this is exactly the opposite of what we've typically been led to believe about how wisdom works, how prejudice works. Prejudice would seem to be all site-specific. Now, that's not how it functions. Prejudice is amazingly globalizable. That's what globalization is a pandemic of prejudice. You see, the allegation of a right to a particular point of view, for example. So if wisdom is so specific and local and particular, it means one generation can't inherit it from the next. That's not what tradition is. This is what it is. You don't inherit your prior generation's spirit work or its labors on behalf of its troubles. What you inherit is the willingness of the prior generation to labor on these troubles. You benefit and you inherit their example, not the content of their achievement or success or failure or however it went, you see? So then the PS on the story is, as people have oftentimes asked me, egads, they say, what would it look like if a generation failed to take up its spirit work, the particulars of its time and those troubles, failed to exercise its moral obligations, to do its collective spirit work on behalf of a better day, including the day to come? And the answer is, this is not hypothesis. Okay, the question comes from the fact that it's already happened. So the subsequent generation becomes an heir to the compound fracture of prior generations, either inability or unwillingness to undertake its work. So now you have a twofold neurotic overlay for the next generation. A, they're inheriting the example of truancy from their predecessors, and they're inheriting the unengaged spirit work of that prior generation, which is to say then that the work that would properly accrue to them, the particulars of their time, become impossible to find under the kind of ameliorating layers of what didn't happen prior to them. And if this happens over subsequent generations, what do you have? You have an ongoing sense of being choked off from access to the present circumstances by this effluent flow of failures simply to apply themselves to the time that they were born to, the people prior to. So all of this is to say then that the principal obligation of any given generation is to attend to its time and to do everything it can to slow, I'm thinking of the West now, to slow the compound fracture of transmission. There's no question that we're receiving transmission from the prior generations. The problem is that what we're receiving is a kind of static bound, half legible, half audible sequence of failures to comply with its time. And this is mistaken now for the freedom to self-actualize, self-designate, self-define. And there's no doubt that John Berger had it right, the English author, when he said, autobiography of all kinds begins with the feeling that you are alone. And there's no question in my mind that the deep and raucous personalization of truth that has occurred during the course of my lifetime is more proof than anybody can bear of the fundamental experience of radicalized aloneness and unsought solitude that the last 20 months is simply the most recent incarnation of.
Yeah, that's wow. It echoes something that hit me about a month ago. I was here and I saw a number of sort of protests that were happening around vaccinations, and it was happening in the street. And what dawned on me was, wow, it's our generation's responsibility to ask, what does it mean to actually be in a participatory democracy? How do we talk about these things? What is actually collective responsibility? What are the consequences of the decisions that we make now? All these things that we felt were sort of done in the past or maybe inherited. And what you're making me question is, was it actually done in the previous generation? I don't know. I mean, you had the League of Nations, you had the creation of nation states and the United Nations. And there was some effort after the First and Second World War, to say, okay, how do we have responsibility towards each other in humanity? What does it mean to progress as a human species? How do we understand humanitarianism and act for the good of all? Our generation has been almost siloed, it feels, from having to bear the weight of that kind of questioning and responsibility and enact it because we've inherited something that we just assumed would work for us. And now that it's not, we're like, hey, what the fuck do we do? We don't actually know.
Which is not seeming to spare anyone from high reactivity and lunging often, what did Monty Python call it? Rushing madly off in all directions, something of that kind. In other words, it's really important for us all to acknowledge that the lack of certainty does not introduce a willingness to slow one's pace. It tends, in a time that's addicted to mastery, to accelerate one's pace instead.
Because it's driven by fear, and I guess uncertainty underneath it is fear.
Well, and underneath the fear is the allegation that you're supposed to live and have available to you a life dictated to you by a user-friendly sequence of certainties. See, this is what the addiction to mastery and competence and control weeps out over the countryside, that you're supposed to know. And then factor in this this eccentric tirade of information, this allegation that you have things available to you as a consequence of being utterly overrun by being led in on things you can do nothing about.
Yes.
That's not what information is. That's a kind of propagandization of your capacity to give a shit.
Yes.
See?
There's
and giving a shit is a very early casualty of hearing too much about things that you have no agency in or participatory consequence in. Right? So all you can do then is shoulder a sense of inevitable consequence and a vague sense that you have been derelict of duty and as such guilty as uncharged because it's getting worse, kind of thing. This amorphous sense that you're fundamentally wrong and there's something fundamentally wrong with you certainly has a biblical root in terms of the West. There's no question. Original sin, etc., and so on. The primordial story is a story of trespass. And it's playing itself out again, right? And in the old days of the pandemic, isn't that a strange phrase already? In the old days of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about where it came from. You remember there's two competing, often contending ideas. One of them from the wet market in that Wuhan, I think is the name of the place. And the other one was people were monkeying around with the chromosomes, right, in the old chemical warehouses, and something broke loose or whatever it was. Either way, if you're a storyteller, you tell it something like this. Well, as can happen from time to time, the membrane that properly set off the wild from the human domain grew uncertain, grew thin and threadbare, and became porous. And the consequence for the human realm of the wild coming too close is an ongoing disaster for the human realm. Even though the prayers and the North Face outfits all weep in the direction of more access to the wild. But the wild is where it is and not with us, architecturally speaking and mythically speaking, for very clear reasons that we cannot bear direct access to anything that is fundamentally not human. We're no good at it. And one of the early indications of that is our attempt to reconfigure every not human thing in anthropocentric terms, to make them available to us, understandable to us. P.S. So we have all the northern peoples, and other peoples have the notion, the myth too, but people who look like me in this world ancestrally have this idea, which is typically called the world tree, right? And the notion unexamined about the world tree is it's somehow establishing a mode of connectivity between the human realm and the godly realm, right? Above and below. You know, you can see the obvious architecture and the fact that it's a living thing and it's a tree and it's very user-friendly for the 21st century, and totally misapprehended as a mythic construct and as a story of real consequence. The purpose of the world tree is not to establish, reestablish, or safeguard the connectivity between the terrestrial realm and the godly realm, between the humans and the gods. The purpose of the tree is to keep them separate. It's holding the sky, if you will, for the sake of the humans. Because whoever put the whole arrangement together knew full well that too much reality undoes the human first. And the amazing thing is that the reverse is not true. In other words, too many humans obliges the wild to bend away from us and to wait it out. And of course, the wild won't reconstitute itself as it was before the humans, but people, we can all imagine a time that the wild can somehow reconstitute itself as it does in a fallow field, for example, after X number of years. But the reverse ability is not there. So this is not just concentric circles of consequence. There's some fundamental compassion built into the arrangement that keeps us one step removed from the gods, that we could not bear looking into God's face. It's questionable whether our humanity would survive the encounter.
Thank you for that, Steve. You bent it around again, to the question that was hovering for me too, which is this, I'm going to call it public or mass recognition, somewhat of what you've brought forth there, which is in the narratives that I see competing, or maybe appropriately the arguments that I see competing, right? There's a sense that this virus or this incursion is just, it's the latest war that we need to go up against, which, seems to mimic the same death phobic war that has been ongoing and that you've had experience in the death trade. And how we, win the war is to, get back to it and triumph, the industrial civilization continue on as it's been. And so for me, that's the part that I feel, you speak of this dread, right? That the plague has brought upon so many, including yourself, and, being able to hover in airports and just to dread, in just new and exciting ways. But for me, there's also this dread in the sense of, well, if we just get, quote, back to it, what's the consequence there? Maybe we know what the consequence has been and continues to be, but that to me feels like, really not, quote, learning the pandemic or learning what this deity is trying to,
Of course. No, you as usual, you got it. There is no, look, learning is not an inevitable consequence of exposure. If it was, we'd be geniuses many times over, unbearably capable, would we not be? And the pandemic would be a slight abrasion on the body politic, right? Okay, that's not the case, because learning is immensely consequential for this alleged body of knowledge that's supposed to be the ground zero of certainty and the defeat of ambivalence and so forth, right? This is why old people, properly old people, they don't know anything anymore. This is why it's easy to jettison them. You see, in a certainty drunk culture, it's easy to forego them entirely. Why? Because their example is otherwise. Their example, not their tutelage, not their instruction. Their example is radically otherwise. They've opted out of the gravy train of certainty, right? Because they've learned too much. And the consequence of learning too much is they know basically nothing, okay? And their alertness to detail is scathing for certainty-addicted people, absolutely scathing. So those among us who are still left, elders that are functioning at that level, are rarely sought out by the people who want to get out from under their functional uncertainties and reacquire the status of I know what's going on, I know what to do, and you can't trick me anymore, kind of thing. They just, the old elders will simply wink and say, wait. Or, this is a good example. So there's always a good moment in any interview to mention Leonard Cohen. And this is that moment, okay? So Leonard, of whom I'm very proud. Leonard Cohen's line when he was being interviewed as I don't remember which record, but it doesn't matter. The gist of it was, the interviewer says, so do young people seek you out? Oh, all the time, he said. And are they asking you for advice? Constantly, he said. About songwriting? Oh, that and, life in general. Really? And do you give them advice when they ask? I do, he says. Well, what do you tell them? He says, I tell them, duck. See, nobody's overly amused. I find that hilarious. But I find it mandatorily hilarious. That is, he's occupying the function I was just articulating. It doesn't mean he doesn't have certain wisdoms. He does, but none of the wisdoms are available to you as certainties and countervailing presences to your worries. What he's offering is a relentless, unblinking understanding that you get creamed. Okay, that's the ordeal. You get creamed and you get knocked down, and maybe you get up again, and maybe you don't.
See, in the present moment, like you said, the inconvenience of consulting one whose response to you is going to be sit with the uncertainty. I won't give you the answer, is why you're seeing it today. Politicians that are speaking on the pandemic all over are donning the robe of indefatigable certainty, right? Because it's the only thing that people need to feel and see, because as you said, in the culture, this is our prejudice, right? Is towards the certainty. Now, we're not consulting the elders, but if the response that they're going to get is be uncertain, people are like, well, we can't handle that. So what does it look like in actually navigating the time where, how do we actually sit within the uncertainty and allow for the ambivalence, but allow it to drive for people to be able to feel that, okay, I'm still in a process. It's still moving us somewhere, participatory, right? Because otherwise, how are we going to do it?
With all due respect, your question is a dead end. You were doing pretty well until the last third.
Yeah.
And then you began to prescribe certain payoffs that have to ensue.
Exactly.
Right? And minus the payoff, then the answer is of no use.
Yes.
So you know what I think what I'm going to tell you, that you don't get the payoff before you do the work. Okay. You don't get to feel you're in the midst of a process of secretly acquiring a secret kind of certainty that somehow excuses you from the old certainties and replaces them functionally with more user-friendly or whatever. It doesn't work that way. Okay. So secondly, the language that you're using apropos of uncertainty is a mastery indulging language. How do you sit how do you occupy the certainty? And the answer is, that's not how it goes. The nature of uncertainty is it does you. You don't do uncertainty, okay? Because it means there's a certain part of you that is being held back in a kind of, what do they call that when somebody dies and in probate? That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, a certain part of you is held back and is not exposed to the fray, right? Well, you send out the shock troops of yourself to perish, in the name of being uncertain. But secretly, you have a certainty about the efficacy of the whole arrangement. So what I'm telling you is, you don't get to have that and authentically be uncertain at the same time. Here's what I mean. So I got a email, very brief one, not so long ago, and it went like this. The woman has read Die-Wise. She's taking care of her dying father. She's the principal caregiver. Everything's going pretty well, she says. However, her father doesn't talk to her about his dying and refuses to do so, and refuses to allow her to do so as well. Okay. And he's about in his mid to late 60s, which is exactly where I am now. And so her dilemma is this. She says to me, I've read Die-Wise. I want to give my father, excuse the term, a Die-Wise death, as if it's a kind of franchised kind of deal. Anyway, that's what she said, a Die-Wise death. And how do I do that while at the same time respecting his wishes and his personal style in not talking about it? You hear the dead end? So my response would say, you can't. At which point she wrote back, could you say a little more about that? Yeah, of course, the dead end is not in what I'm saying to you. It's what you said. You want to respect your father's wishes not to say anything, and you want everything to work out. But I'm telling you, your father's refusal is an abrogation of his paternal responsibility to you. He does not have the right to keep his dying from you, no matter what his personal inclinations are. So that is not to be respected. What's to be respected is the paternal obligation to someone that he helped bring into this world and drag across the threshold, knowing that she would have to die someday. And if he's never thought the thought before now, his own dying should bring him to it. And that's what love does. Love changes, you see. It's not a still point in a turning world. Love is the turning world. And so he had no freedom to do that. and she had no obligation to, quote, respect that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Steve. At the risk of putting on a special, we got Die-Wise Deaths on sale now. You can see on the bottom ticker. Will be on sale after this.
Product placement.
Yep.
Yeah.
All jokes aside, and I'm glad you brought up Death Wisdom, because that is that's another really, I suppose, I mean, it's a presence in the book that you've written, Your Generation's Worth. The first chapter, of course, is looking at Die-Wise now through the prism of this moment, and that's the I mean, the sorrow I see within in some ways, I think you're right. The presence of death or more dying in such a public fashion could prompt more, I mean, death skillfulness or death wisdom, or whatever one could bring to it, and yet there's very little evidence that seems to be happening. And so in that sense, the continuation of what's been there in the past. And I mean, you had this phrase, something like, what is it? So what's it going to take actually to change you, right? To be changed by it. And that's what I'd love to ask too is, what does it mean to be changed by it in this moment?
Well, it means that you understand that pandemic is a God. It's a deity. It is a divine presence. But like all divine presences, it is not benign, and it is not there to facilitate your inner life. It has its work, it has its commitment, it has its loyalties and allegiances, okay? And these can be learned by us, but learned at the concert, at the casualty, and casualties are inevitable in learning. The learning would be the realization that we knew very little about how to be plagued, right? We knew how to submit it to our self-mastery designs. Well, that's not knowing. That's another prejudice, right? At the risk of self-aggrandizement, which Canadians are horrible at, and I am one, if you'd be so kind and indulge me for a minute, this might be worth listening to. It's a little more cogent in writing than I might be able to pull off in person. But it's the same person talking. See what you think. This is apropos, I think, of what you've just asked me. The plague has confounded the old hard-to-defend days of easy travel. There's something in all of this that has brought me back to all of those deathbeds all those years ago. I'm wondering whether I credited the dread and the terror of those dying people as I might have done and should have done then. The terror and the dread, never did it come in for much scrutiny by the parties to the endeavor in those days. Sadness and despair and depression, yes, they were much more amenable to consultation, and they probably still are. But there's something about dread that beggars ordinary speech, that is communicable, yes, but only among the dreadful, the cognoscenti. Now consider the onset of an allergy. The first flower of allergy is unnerving in its foreignness and in the unfamiliar swelling and galloping reactivity. By this, I'm talking about the culture here. That, it turns out, is just a warning. Your body is disinhibited now, and it has a wartime capability, a weapons-grade alertness that you yourself never imagined. It knows something about ruthless, merciless, vigilante self-care. It knows about shoot, then talk, self-policing, and it can swell into paralysis, it can swell to asphyxia, it can swell unto death, and you along with it, in the name of protecting itself. And the first event, harsh as it is, that's only the beginning. For you and your noble conveyance have become sensitized. Now, that's the word that's used. That means that every subsequent encounter with the prompter will ratchet up the guardian spirit of your metabolics and your respiration to a fever pitch of agitated defense. It knows how to man the barricades now and how to choke off access to the command and control center of your embattled, once nimble bone house. It is on call, on demand, and an exponential first responder. Your sensitivity has become morbid now. With that, I'm suggesting that there's something about the ubiquity of this communicative device that we are speaking across now that is an enabler of that kind of hypersensitized, highly reactive, utterly ungoverned, deeply irresponsible capacity to simply kick out the jams, and to feel legitimized in doing so because the uncertainties are so ignoble and so corrosive that the entitlement is almost inevitably ensuing from the encounter. Mm-hmm. If anybody feels terrified, not at the consequence of my tirade here, but simply by looking out the window, I would say your sense of terror is utterly legitimate. It is utterly legitimate. This time is a kind of uncharted time. And forget that nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. It's always been a given. But think about this. The notion, you see in the advertising now, do you not? Welcome back, they say. Things are opening up, and all of this kind of thing. To what? Well, what are they welcoming back? I have an answer for you. It's a number. 2019. I would never have guessed that the consequence of 20 months of relative isolation has been to lionize and to mythologize the, quote, personal freedoms that were available to us in 2019, as if that year is the high watermark of cultural achievedness. And as soon as we get back to that, man, all will be well, and we can finally get rid of Trudeau or whatever the solution is supposed to be.
Absolutely. What you said about the allergy and the paralysis that can ensue, the asphyxiation is really evidence from what happens in social media. That's what's happening. We're paralyzing ourselves almost unknowingly. It's like a boa constrictor that's slowly wrapping ourselves up the more that we try to struggle. Now, what do? I'm going to be that guy.
Don't you?
I'm going to be that guy. No, I'm going to be the guy. And I'm putting my head on the chopping block enough times, but
Yeah. Okay. Well, what do you do? Listen to the tense with which you wielded the phrase.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're asking about the future, but that's not the tense that you used. No. What do you do?
Yeah.
Is a question about what's actually happening.
Yes.
And I think we're in more agreement than our joking is letting on here, that the circumstances at hand are observable. This is not a matter of opinion as to what do we do. And so my response has tended to be, every time people ask me for a solution, I direct their attention, often frustrating them, towards what? Towards the dilemma that they're trying to get out from under. See, so the conviction in most questions is the dilemma has no inherent value to spend time with. The only real value is to be derived from the solution or the answers. Mm-hmm. So my contention over and over again, and Ian at this point is clouding over because he knows this by heart, that one good question is worth 10,000 really good answers. And here's why. Because an answer ungenerously rendered has the consequence of annihilating or asphyxiating or crucifying the question and ending it functionally for all time. And I'm suggesting to you that if a question is well wrought, it will survive the answers that you inflict upon it, as it properly should. Because I think human beings at their best are questioning beings and wondering beings, not knowing beings. In that sense, our kind of ontology is ongoingly cocked to one side, if you will, right? And this should, in a circumstance of alleged higher education, that should be the reward system. The more confounded you are, the higher marks you get, provided that you can bring to bear your capacity for real eloquence upon your consternation, not to dispel your consternation, but to give it a seat at the head table, finally. Because consternation, unregarded, becomes monstrous. And we are in the monster-making business unawares. And if we've learned nothing from the last 20 months, we should have learned our capacity to generate monstrosity at a moment's notice with virtually no provocation, as if we have the technology and the intuition available to us ongoingly.
Steve, you brought up monsters there, and I'm grateful. There's in the school and both at our reading that I helped put on a few weeks ago now, I suppose, you spoke about Beowulf, right? As a story that there's a motif there, of course. And I wonder if you might just illuminate that a little as a recognition of this moment of monstering a monster. What monsters a monster and its relation to hospitality or not?
Right. Well, at a school not that long ago, I'm not clear that it's ever going to happen again, actually. But in the time, it seemed to me that English-speaking people had an obligation to learn their, if you will, their mother book, which is what Beowulf is. It's the oldest Anglo-Saxon iteration that exists, older than most of the material culture that's available in museums and so on. And in the story, there seems to be almost as many monsters as there are people. And I used to ask you in school, was there ever such a thing as monsters? And most of you wouldn't even make eye contact with me when I asked the question. It was so embarrassing. It's so beneath us all, unless I was being Jungian about the whole thing, which everybody was secretly hoping I was. You mean a projection of my animus? Nope. I mean a monster. So I'm, of course, going out on a limb here and saying, yes, indeed, there was such a thing as monsters, but they weren't always, quote, monstrous. Something happened to them, or something stopped happening. And the cessation of that sustaining element, which I'm going to talk about in a second, had the consequence of crafting monstrosity from this particular kind of life form. So the story is, it's a very brief moment, close to the beginning of the story. So Grendel, who's named, comes down, as it says, from the mist bands up in the high hills, just at dusk. And is drawn by what? By flesh and blood? Doesn't say that. Drawn by the possibility of carnage and inflicting horrible mayhem upon the humans? The assumption of original sin is right there. And the answer is nope, that's nowhere to be found in the story. Because this is a story that predates being missionized by monotheistic Christianity. That's its wonder, that it survived. And how did it survive? In a monastery, if you can believe it. Scribes in a monastery transcribed the story. So the irony is that the Christian missionaries preserved the pre-Christian monstrosity, which is Beowulf. Thank God, or somebody, for that. So it goes like this then. There's a moment, it says, that Grendel was drawn to the doorway, the closed door of the feast hall. For inside, a raging feast was going on. Humans were being human unto themselves, and the very best of them was being poured forward in the terms of, mead wisdom and the extraordinary lying that was going on by way of the storytellers and all the rest. And there was enough food and especially warmth of all kinds and a deep company. That's what the word means. With bread, table fellowship. All of this was there. But the door was closed. And this was an endogamous arrangement among humans. And it excluded something. That's what it says. Because the door was closed. And the exclusion was Grendel. And so there's a moment when Grendel pleads to be allowed in. Now, subsequent events reveal that Grendel knew full well that he could blast that place to kingdom come with brute force, because he subsequently does it. But in that moment, he withholds all of his energy and touches the door ever so gently, pawing it, pleading for some kind of admission into the conviviality that humans are reserving for themselves and each other. And of course, the story is that by virtue of the din, nobody heard it. The door was not opened or left open a crack. Grendel couldn't mistake nothing for a welcome and could not take another night of soulless solitude, and broke the door, and the rest is the Beowulf story. So who made the monster? Well, the failure of the humans to include the not human world. It's very clear. There's no interpretation necessary. It's just the sequence of the story is telling you there. So I've claimed routinely now over the last 20 months that the pandemic is a god, but it's quickly being monstered because the refusal to give it its due as a deeply instructional event, to learn its ways. I'm not talking about the metabolics of its infection rates and all that sort of stuff. I mean, learn that if you want to. I'm talking about, why is it appearing now? Why has it come among us as it has? Why is it as globalizable as this technology? What does it have in common with this technology? And how is it that it's become more an attribute of prejudice than it once was, when it was an attribute of divinity and wisdom, which all of these things, when they've come among humans, have tended to be in the early going. People fall down in awe at the encounter with something that's not human. Right? There is no awe and there is no falling down. There is problem solving, there is demonizing, and there is the choosing of sides. And the scar tissue that the extremities are leaving upon the youngest generation, the people who will have no memory of a time before the pandemic, is all but unendurable as something to imagine. And P.S., people of your generation have to get hip very quickly to the understanding that the youngest among us are not looking to my generation for another example of what to blame for how things have gone so terribly awry. That's what you did with us. They are looking at you, and they're watching you right now because you are their seniors. I wonder if most of you are conducting yourself as if you are having consequence unintended for the youngest among you. I wish you would.
You said a line that made me pause, which is something to the effect of not recognizing the divinity of what's arisen. And that, would that be analogous to opening the door for Grendel to come in and partake and join, which diffuses the monster? Is that what you're
Try to
saying?
get the last part. Which
diffuses the monster. I mean, because you say a monster is made, but if it's recognized or seen for what it is, then it may not be a monster.
Well, yes, but please don't read into my rendering, very quick rendering of the story there, the suggestion that otherwise Grendel is a benign presence sitting in the corner, willing to shit in a box like a lapdog.
No, not at all. It's Grendel.
Sorry for the vernacular there, but no, indeed, if you let a god into the house, I mean, best to nail down the furniture. Okay, but good luck with that, of course, because you come into the house the next day and much of your furniture is on the ceiling. That survives the presence of the god. My point being this, that the god is not inherently visiting wreckage upon your arrangement. The god simply obeys other rules, no? And
Everything's upside down.
The radicalized rules of hospitality come from the gods. They don't come from the humans. Because after all, for reasons I cannot possibly discern, but I'm glad that they're there, it seems that the divine world ongoingly engages us as if we are guests, and visits upon us a degree of real hospitality in the form of gravity and photosynthesis, right? And a bloodstream that works, etc., etc. In other words, the natural order of things is the divine hospitality extended towards humans. The degree range that the earth sustains, that makes it livable from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and basically, or until recently. So all of these things are an indication that we are in some fashion, room is made for us. You see, we, on the other hand, seem to have virtually no capacity to respond in kind, barely to each other, and certainly not to anything that's not human. Which is to say that our capacity for animism, which I think was the primordial religious understanding of human beings, has been so compromised now that we've occupied involuntarily, even the most radicalized pagans among us occupy the monotheistic understanding, which goes something like this. The many God religions have historically never had a problem with the one God religions. This is an amazing thought to think. For the many God religions, the one God religions are simply the religion or the God that their pantheon did not include. They just didn't come up with the idea that one God thought he was the only God. None of their gods had that attribute. And when that God comes around, the pantheists, the polytheists, have the capacity to go, wow, who would have thought of such a thing? This is amazing. Surely our pantheon is complete now. And there's a degree of celebratoriness to it. And the dismaying realization is the reverse never takes place. The monotheistic orientation has no tolerance for the many God religions. And I'm afraid that there's something about the many God religions which has its counterpoint in that kind of radical hospitality that the world extends to us. And our inability to respond in kind has attributes of that monotheistic intolerance for a many-goded place. And P.S., the word pandemic means many demons loosed upon the world. The word demon does not ever mean what it means today. It means those who were born, when you were born, a kind of titular spirit or guardian spirit. That's the old understanding of what a demon was. So when you have a pandemic, you have many titular or guardian spirits cut loose from their guardianship. And so you infer chaos from this, or worse, malevolence. But neither one of those things are there. It's a consequence of our inability and our unwillingness to claim those spirits that were entrusted to us, right? That were nominally supposed to accompany us through our days, and to be given a seat at the head table of real honor and regard, to become part of our company and our kinship understanding. And no wonder we are so damn lonely that we're looking towards the next century as another place where something is slouching towards Bethlehem to be born again.
Stephen, I'm not sure if it was something that you'd crafted yourself, or it was a quote, I think, from a poem or something, but this idea that it's human to forget how to be human. Yeah. And yet, the real sort of danger is all humans forgetting at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. And there's something in, I think, what you're saying of this forgetting. I don't know if you could sort of put it on modern industrial civilization or needing to go there at all, but just a sense of this, real forgetting of hospitality, forgetting of deep reciprocity that monsters the world. I see that now in the story with Grendel there, that the world has become monstrous to us. And in that sense, this oppositional, force is sort of inevitable as the world rises up now in an ever more chaotic, emergent unfolding as the climate destabilizes and all the rest. And that the dominant response is sort of like, oh, whoa, it's getting more monstrous. but it seems to be a deep consequence of this very forgetting that you're talking about, this inability to recognize radical hospitality that has been there, now seems to be, I don't know, the danger of being withdrawn by the world. It seems to be on the table in some fashion, given, heat waves here and deluges there. And so I wonder again, is that the consequence of this great forgetting of also, which I've heard, used sometimes to describe this time?
I think I would characterize it as a functional schizophrenia, a kind of sociopathic schizophrenia. That's the way the modern arrangement strikes me. And what I mean by that is that it's not like any of us in this call are saying anything that nobody's ever thought of, that nobody's ever seen, that we're somehow generating, reams of brilliance here that has no precedent. The fact is that wisdom is only wisdom by virtue of its recognizability, not by virtue of its novelty. That's what advertising is. Okay? Number one. Number two, what we're doing here is trying to remember, not initiate, not orchestrate, remember. And you recall from your school days what that means. So the functional opposite of remember is not forget, it's dismember. Okay? And dismember means what? There was some kind of intactness. Call it a primordial intactness that visits itself upon every newborn human. So you understand your own beginnings as characterized as a kind of primordial intactness that's represented by your parents, typically, right? Your hovering, helicoptering parents, if you will. And I lost my way there. I just summoned that image and then it came. And wow. Please remind me what I was just saying.
Dismember, to remember, to dismember.
Thank you. Right. See, I forgot. So something happened to that primordial intactness. It happens in the life of every human being sooner or later. And it seems to have happened fundamentally in the, quote, family of mankind, if you will. That there is a shared understanding that the original intactness of our primordial existence is not available to us directly anymore as a lived experience. It is available to us, though, as a memory. So there's the interesting, if you will, or confounding thing. How can you have a memory of something that you have not lived? My allegation here is that is what ancestry is. Because by virtue of the vector of your ancestry, you do have some kind of strange access to the truth of the matter, that there was a primordial intactness. And you can think of it as original violation, or you can think of it as original forgetting, right? Okay, so the restorative gesture is one of remembering, not reconstituting. So this is why I'm always hesitant to go in the direction of solutions, because solutions are reconstituting. But what I'm advocating here is the capacity for injurious memory, for grief-encrusted memory, right? And this will never fail you, because it will never allow you easily to turn grief into another mobilizing principle that you can gather others around you and go find a new religion. Grief it won't go that way. It says, you go off and be stupid by yourself. That's what it says. And I'll be over here should you ever come to your senses again. But there's no punishment involved, you see. You've forgotten again. And this is why, as you reminded me, we have the word human in the English language, and then we have another word when we put an E on the end of the word. So if the word human is so all-encompassing and such an obvious given, then why did humans, English-speaking humans that is, come up with the word humane? And the answer is, it's a confession. And what does it confess? That humans are capable of the most bestial, not the best word there, the most criminal inhumanity and not just to other humans either. Alas, one of the signs of our disrepute is that we reserve the word inhuman behavior for the particular behavior we visit upon each other. But in truth, our real understanding of our inhuman behavior can be seen in our unwillingness to acknowledge the alivedness of everything around us and its participation in soulfulness and the obvious moral obligations that accrue to us that should ensue from that understanding.
If I might, there's a question actually that's come in from Celador Lenore, which speaks to this membering, I think, or in this case, dismembering. And I can bring her question up here. And she says, I love the relation of the pandemic to a god or a monster, the image of Grendel pawing at the door. What do you think of the monsters being created by denying hospitality to the unvaccinated? There's a second part of this, by which I mean, are we discluding a portion of the population now, the vaccine passports, the warmth and not available to them? Are we in the business of monster making that way as well?
Right. But who's we? Okay, now the question occupies, apparently, the position of, quote, being vaccinated, as if this is a monolith, as if the vaccinated are a, card-carrying, I mean, literally, I suppose now, but a kind of, that their real vaccination is that they all think the same way, kind of thing. So you can hear the monotheism alert and adroit even in the question. So let's allow the distinct possibility that, quote, everyone who's vaccinated has very little in common one with the other as things go. They temporarily overlap in the matter of the willingness, maybe not even willingness. Maybe they caved into the vaccination. Who knows what the scheme of motivation might be that visited itself upon people. I mean, they calculated their willingness to be in an ICU and be intubated, maybe. Like myself, I worked in those places. I know what it looks like. It's not something I was going to subject myself to if I could do something about it. But the greater responsibility, the greater attempt to translate responsibility, it seems to me now, available to us all, but not claiming us all in equal measure, is this. If we can die from each other, which is what the pandemic means, if that's a new cause of death on the death certificate, if it should properly and poetically say that instead, then one of the direct moral translations of the matter is this. If we can die of each other, then like it or lump it and take it down the road and dump it. The truth of the matter is we are fundamentally consequential in the health lives of each other. And alas, to me, all of the staking of, extreme position refuses to want that to be so and wills it out of the picture and replaces it with the inalienable human right to self-determination, which is a fairly recent aberration in the understanding of mutual responsibility that goes back eons long and is the fount and the foundation of village-mindedness. Look, there's no merit in simplifying the question that's been asked. There's many things contending in the question, right? And I'm not inclined to participate in each one of them, to be honest, largely because these kind of things are being occupied elsewhere, and let them be occupied elsewhere. All of us, I don't think, have an obligation to fire on the same cylinders as everybody else and assume the same set of conditions and concerns and hyper concerns as others, right? That's not my job, right? But I'm sorry. The last thing I'll say as a PS is I do appreciate the question and the prompt that's in it, but I feel no obligation to line up behind the conditions and the terms that the question occupies, just for the sake of answering it, you see. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. No,
I was interrupting, but one thing that the question brought up for me that I've been sitting with is that if one of, as you said on the death certificate, is that we can die of each other, there have been many voices that have been clamoring around the threat that we pose, not just to human beings, but to the planet as a whole. I mean, if vegans start grandstanding on the platform saying, you know, factory farming is causing a dearth of disease and illness for the natural world, the immense suffering for animals, and the diseases of modern industrial civilization like heart disease and diabetes and all these things that are being propagated by our scrupulous consumption of animals and what havoc it's wreaking, should we not just say, well, let's mandate not eating meat anymore, available in the grocery stores or in the restaurants, because there's a verifiable impact that this is having, injurious to life? Where do we draw such lines? Because all of a sudden this has become a virtue.
Yeah, it has. Well, who's the we again? Where do we draw lines? Because the whole notion of line drawing is against other people. Right? That's where that notion comes from. It's a boundary that's designed to keep the pagans on one side of the wall and the civilized on the other side. The whole notion of line drawing, boundary making, and so on basically come from that thing. So my inclination when I'm, confronted and confounded by, kind of a moral order transgressed as you described it, is to say, wait a second, it's not the consumption of, quote, animals that generates the tidal wave of illness as you characterize it. It's more what you acknowledge. It's the factory farm orientation. It seems to me, I'm saying this to you as a small scale mixed farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm not defending my circumstance. I'm saying this instead, that there is some inherent sustainability and sustaining quality to the willingness to small scale farm. Okay, the factory farm that you articulated is as much a monstrosity as the Industrial Revolution wool mill was a monstrosity. Mm-hmm. There's no question, but it's the same mind. It's the same willingness to enslave another life form. That's all true. Okay, but I can't corroborate the notion that if we just stopped eating meat, the whole thing would just magically go to an infestation dump and decompose, and in 2 generations we can plant our melons there.
And it's exactly the same point that I think more of the discerning and ambivalent people in the center are saying, perhaps just mandating one mono solution, that if everybody gets the vaccine, everybody will be safe from killing each other, from disease. And so there's people who are in between who are saying, how do we walk this line? Okay, maybe line, you've made me think about the word line differently now as I say it. But this is a very curious place to be, because as you said, going back to Yeats' poem, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And the passionate intensity is coming from people who are on the extremes, which are representing the so-called prejudice of everybody. Whereas, like you said, everybody who gets vaccinated is not the same. They don't think the same. And everybody who doesn't also doesn't think the same, but they're being painted in the same light by the extremes. That's where we find ourselves.
Attempt to generalize as if everybody is found on a continuum of conviction. So this is the thing I'd like to deeply, not call into question, absolutely challenge. The notion that the willingness to be utterly, ruthlessly conscious in a time like this can be characterized as a continuum of some kind of personal conviction. The willingness to inhabit the obligation to conduct oneself as if the health of other people is at stake in your behavior is not a matter of a continuum of extremity. It's a willingness to opt out of the extremes, you see? And a willingness, I think, to acknowledge the following, that your personal, not a phrase I like anymore, your personal rights and freedoms are a consequence of our mutual willingness to conduct ourselves as if each other's health is at stake. That's where your rights and freedoms come from. It's not as if the willingness to bear each other in mind is an unscrupulous incursion upon your rights and freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
That is the unspoken other half of a lot of the stuff I'm hearing, and it's not all extreme. Let's put it this way, if you will, if we want to use the linear analogy. The ruthless occupation of the middle place is as extreme a position as the one it imagines itself to be an alternative to.
Mm.
Okay? I'm talking about cultivating the ability to be fundamentally undone by the ambivalence of the circumstance is what preserves your humanity.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Okay? And your willingness or your fear-driven unwillingness to be fundamentally, functionally uncertain makes you dangerous. Okay, so here's the thing. We use the word safety now. Oh my God. People are looking at you, screaming at you through your windshield. Be safe, they're saying. Be safe with an exclamation mark, as if this is a moral code. Wait a second. Being safe presumed, stay safe is the term I was looking for. Staying safe presumes that there was a safety for you to maintain. So my point is the real important safety announcement, not just for the pandemic, but for modernity, is there is no safety. Okay, safety means you are insured against the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. But you're a human being with a body and feelings. That's not available to you, right? You're in for it, man. That's why Cohen said, my best advice to you is duck from time to time.
Thank you, Steve. I understand we do have some other comments coming in as well, but I also understand our time is almost complete here as you are out the door to continue your tour, I think, pretty soon. And I mean, I'm left with, it's a phrase it's actually from a graphic novel series, I believe, Sandman, but the line by one of the characters that they write, I believe, is something like that everybody gets a life, and that's it, and there's something in that, in the way that you speak about death and that closeness of death is not necessarily a question of proximity, but sort of a willingness to maybe release any potentiality or something, or any claims to potentiality that one is deserved. And in some ways, it feels like all of the modern West is built upon this, right? This sense of potentiality that is entitled to. Therefore, when anything interrupts that triumphant lunge, that somehow that's oppositional. And to me, it strikes me that the pandemic is, if anything, a deity of limit, right, or a goddess of limit. And so I'm left to know this line, and perhaps I'd offer it, and then I'd love to hear you speak to it. As you write in your book, any life to come needs our life, our way of life, to end.
Yeah, it's very stilling, no? And I think coming to the end of a tirade like this one that I've been culpable in should stop voluntarily before it ends. And a sense of stillness, not peace, please, not contentment, not affability, but an unsought visitation of being stilled, right? Of coming to the highway sign that says, be prepared to stop, and stopping before you have to. There is a relief of a kind that is borders on the unspeakable, right? But it's a relief that enables you rather than cocoons you, if you will. So yes, it's very clear, is it not? The God of the pandemic, among other things, is whispering to us something like this. Well, it's what they did in Iceland. I can't improve on this at all. From what I hear, so there's a quickly receding glacier. This is only in the last couple of years. And somebody in Iceland, whether it's a government body, whoever it is, put up a marker that has 3 phrases on it, perhaps in Icelandic, in English, I don't know. And the first one said, we know what's happening. And the second one said, we know what must be done. And the third one said, only you will know if we did it. Now, involuntarily, you could imagine that this is addressed to the future. And somehow, I don't know why Westerners go to the future all the time as the place where all the cool shit lives. But anyway, that's what we do. Okay. But I'm an animist, so I'm going to suggest to you the marker is addressing itself to the receding glacier. And it's saying, you have a sentience and a memory that we're not capable of. And you are receding from us, right? We have become an unsustainable presence to you, though your mass is so much greater than us, but our consequence is greater than yours. Mm-hmm. This should still modern humans. And it's proper for us to be arrested. And in our mania to occupy a position about the plague and our frustration that the nominal guest of honor of the thing won't give all the answers, won't acknowledge all the positions and all the legitimacies and so on. Wait a second. Everything doesn't have to happen at once. But I can promise you this. The notion of direct action and revolutionary change is not a consequence of your ability to be inflexible. Real radical change is a consequence of its time, not an infliction from beyond into its time. Real wisdom is a child of its time, and all the growth rings and all the stretch marks and all the birthmarks that accrue to wisdom belong there. And the worst thing it seems to me we could do now is throw the people that we don't understand under the bus, ideologically speaking, right? To enable our bus to continue unimpeded.
Mm. Wow. Well, Stephen, perhaps a perfect place to acknowledge the limitation of our time.
Right.
And yeah, with real gratitude, thank you for speaking to us today about all of this, and highly encourage all the listeners to get a copy of the book, A Generation's Worth, and wishing you a kind road on the rest of your tour.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. And thank you for sparing me the wish for me to be safe, stay safe, or in any way feel obligated to the safety. But I could tell you, we've been very careful about convening, not with others, but becoming the occasion for others to convene. And the most heart-rending aspect of the last 2 weeks has been this. So many people, so scared of each other, so scared of the commons, so scared of the indoors, all of which is understandable, even mandatory, have come to me in their ones and twos and at a safe distance whispered the following. This is the first time I've been out of the house in 20 months, and I don't know how to behave anymore. And that's heartbreaking. And it's some kind of beginning. Not knowing how to behave is a radical posture in a place, in a time of certainty. And I'm standing by people's inability to know how to behave anymore and calling that a brave and a courageous act. And I salute those of us who are now have become constitutionally unsure of ourselves and our way of life, and say to you, would that the old certainties never visit you again, and your ambivalence becomes your disorganized religion.
I hope.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.